Welcome to Of Knights and Pilgrims, a podcast about Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene. I'm Christian Leithart, and I'm here with Dr. David Grubbs.
Hello, hello.
Before we get right into it, there's a couple of background noises. We're recording at a school, and there's a student practicing piano in the background. So if you hear beautiful music, that's just part of the vibe of what's going on here.
Yeah, it's not in your head. It's actually here.
Right, yes. But I think it provides a good background for our conversation today. Before you listen to this, it might be helpful to have read or listened to Canto 1 of Book 1 of The Faerie Queene. You could either listen to the Thomas Copeland LibriVox recording, which we highly recommend, or read it yourself. I'm actually going to be referencing the Roy Maynard updated version that's published by Canon Press, just because I find it much easier to scan through and find stuff than Spenser's original spelling. So that's what I'll be referencing. David's got the big fat one.
Yeah. I have the
real
big fat
version.
Penguin Classics, edited by Thomas P. Roach Jr., but with all the wonky Elizabethan spellings that that delight and frustrate us so much.
So we're going to start with like a quick summary of the chapter, and then kind of just bounce around and talk about what struck us, what interested us. This isn't going to be a like line by line commentary so much as just the two of us exuding our is that the right word? Exuding our love of the book and the exciting start to the adventures. It is really incredible how quickly you get into action in this story. He wastes no time in getting this guy into an adventure. So the first book starts with this little 4-stanza prologue where it's the invocation of the muse, kind of classic epic convention. Homer does this, Virgil does this. But Spenser kind of puts his own spin on things. He is invoking the muse to help him tell the story. But there's, I think it's revealing that he says, lo, I, the man whose muse. It's not the muse. It's almost like he has an individual muse, or it's like a gift to him, not the muse, the goddess. And I think that's probably, I know Milton was a little later, but it's probably in keeping with Milton, who straight up acknowledges the Holy Spirit as his muse. That this is a divine, perhaps Spenser thought of it as a more individual thing, like maybe some individual angel was guiding his pen. But it's clearly, he's clearly giving thanks to God here.
And referencing his former poetic accomplishments. His muse had whilom masked him in lowly shepherd's weeds, he says. He's referencing a previous work of his, The Shepherd's Calendar, which he wrote under the persona of Colin Clout was the name.
What a great name.
Yeah. And some of the commendatory verses, which we haven't talked through, reference Colin Clout, the character, as a kind of poetic persona of Edmund Spenser. So
he
here
also
he
mentions
is,
right in line 2, like as time her taught. So and he's implying, well, or saying the muse kind of has this way of inspiring shepherds to tell these epic stories, and that seems like a reference to Virgil, who started with pastoral poetry. It was kind of like, this is just how you do it. You write about nature and the rustic things, and then you graduate to great subjects. For Virgil, that would be the founding of Rome, and for Spenser, the founding of England.
Yeah,
the quest
in a
for
way,
Gloriana.
the heart, or the chivalric, the noble heart of what should make England and her leaders strong.
Yeah, I suppose there's something similar in the Aeneid, where it's like a shaping of the ideal Roman that Aeneas is going through, and we have a similar thing here, but it takes 12 nights, 7.5 nights, 6.5 nights. So I thought it was interesting at the end of the prologue where he references these pagan gods. He mentions Cupid, Venus, Mars, but he talks about how Mars, he's going to array himself in gentle jollities, which I thought that's such a Christian spin on Mars here has to become jolly. He has to become like Jove and kind of revel in happiness. So it's not that war is completely ignored, but that there's a sort of happiness or satisfaction to war that I don't recall reading about in any classical literature.
I took this as a reference to the seduction of Mars by Venus. You've probably seen too the pictures of Mars dallying with Venus, and Cupid's on the scene, and Mars has laid aside all of his warlike gear. So the idea is that war has been made peaceful through love.
Right. Which is it again, that seems like a very Christian, not that that would necessarily be completely completely foreign to the pagan mind, but this idea that, well, he says of fierce wars and faithful loves. That's his song. Which those things are not contradictory at all. Fierce loves and faithful wars, maybe. There's he might have just changed it up.
Yeah. Well, and then he laterals from talking about Greco-Roman gods to the goddess heavenly bright, mirror of grace and majesty divine, the great lady of the greatest isle, who is, I mean, surprise, surprise, it's Elizabeth. So here's the patron that he seeks.
We spent a while talking about this
Yep.
in the last episode. So if you skipped that one, go back and I think David did a good job explaining the historical context for that, but also like it's not just Elizabeth. There's a whole background. There's a lot more going into that relationship than simply I'm trying to butter up this sovereign so that she'll pay me money to continue being a poet.
But she is she's presented in this poem in the way Augustus is presented in the Aeneid. Right. So he also has that classical paradigm too.
Right. So moving into Canto 1, I think I fell in love with this poem right from this opening canto because you get right into the action, and to have this, like, you're kind of prepping for this old poem and you think, okay, I just got to slog through this. So we were both assigned it in school. But then within a couple of pages, you get him fighting this monster in a quite graphic battle. But I suppose we should start with that opening image, which I think I mentioned in a previous episode, the pictorial side of Spenser's poetry, that he's almost more than any other older poet, he's able to describe these images. He does describe action, but these pageants, he's almost skilled at describing what a painter might do. And so you get this image. I think he would have been a great animator.
Yeah.
You get this sort of landscape, and this knight comes riding into the frame, pricking or spurring his horse. And you zoom up on him for a minute on the details of his appearance, and then he describes the lady with him, and then kind of offhandedly mentions a couple other people accompanying him that are then kind of more or less forgotten. The lamb never really shows up again. The dwarf plays a couple of roles and then vanishes. But I just loved the opening image of this knight riding slowly across the plain. And there's this mystery about him. He's wearing armor that's not his because he's inexperienced, but the armor has all these dents of old battles. So just from a purely adventure story element, you've got this really captivating opening image. A beardless youth in old armor, followed by a woman who is, she's wearing white but wrapped in a dark cloak. So there's a sort of secret side of her. I think it's a very good adventure story opening.
Sort of meeting expectations in some way. Here's the knight with the mighty arms and the silver shield, but then there's the contrast. The young knight in the old armor, and the same thing with the fair lady. You expect the common fair lady of a chivalric romance, but she's dressed more like a nun than a princess.
It even mentions she's wearing a wimple, right?
Yes. Immediately you get what you expect, but it's not what you expected.
Right. Which I think is one of the things that has made Spenser survive where other medieval romances haven't, that he's able to excite your expectations. It's not like he's just elevating it a little bit beyond kind of the conventions of the genre. I was wondering about the In stanza 2, it says that, so there's this contrast of, he's this jolly knight, which doesn't just mean happy. There's a sort of joviality is not simply like I'm laughing and joking all the time, but it's sort of like satisfaction. But it says he's too solemn sad, and I was wondering, the lady is sad because the whole backstory is that her parents are trapped by this dragon. But in stanza 2, it sounds like, but of his cheer did seem too solemn sad. And what's going on with the Red Cross Knight's background that he's carrying this sorrow with him?
Well, the only reference in the stanza that might explain it is that this is Red Cross Knight. This is the Knight of the Red Cross. And so it explains that on his breast, a bloody cross he bore, the dear remembrance of his dying lord. So on one hand, the notion of the young squire, or the young knight, or the son of a knight, taking up the arms of the master or the father in order to avenge, that's a thing that's encountered in other chivalric romance. The notion of bearing the old arms in order to avenge the feud. Except that this, so on one hand, it fits that trope, but this dying lord, dead as ever living, him adored. So that, is the Lord dead? The bloody cross refers to the death of the Lord, but also this Lord is adored as living, right? So he's resurrected. And we talked about this in the first couple of episodes, that Spenser is, especially in the first book, weaving theological allegory throughout.
I also think it's important to note, just from the allegorical perspective, which maybe we can touch on next. And I got this from the Maynard book, that this character it's not like Christian in Pilgrim's Progress, who's moving away from sin and then has this conversion moment in the story. The Red Cross Knight is already a Christian. This is a process of a Christian going through the Christian life and being sanctified by his various adventures that he comes through. But we're not, like, he's already wearing the cross and wearing the armor of God as described in Ephesians 6. This is not a conversion story. It's more of a sanctification story.
Yes. So Spenser is a Protestant. He's a faithful member of the Church of England and has the sorts of grudges that an Elizabethan Church of Englander would have, which we'll get into. But among the things that he's affirming here is that the Red Cross Knight has a kind of positional righteousness, which here is pictured as a borrowed chivalry. He wears the heroism of another, not to avenge the other's death, because the other did not remain dead. The other is living and adored as living. So he does not need to avenge his lord, but instead wears the remnants of his lord's battles and victories. He arrives as an untried knight, but he is wearing all of the trophies of conquest.
Yeah, I think that might be something kind of lacking in our Christian traditions, being Baptist and Reformed, that there's like the idea of wearing someone else's armor and that being sufficient to engage in battles against temptation. Even though we describe like we're wearing Christ, where his righteousness is imputed to us. Just as an image, we would probably think of like you are changed and you're not borrowing Jesus's equipment. But here the image is like, no, he's actually, in a way, it doesn't matter who's wearing the armor almost. It could be any rustic knight who's adopted this role.
With his name, George, he is both a reference to St. George, but also George of the Georgics. He's a farmer. He's a rustic whose name is Rustic.
Right. Yeah.
and as a result, he becomes a kind of everyman figure. He is one who was in the old Adam, the first farmer, being remade in the image of the the last Adam, the second farmer.
I don't want to jump ahead too much, but I think there's a lot to this where this guy fails over and over and over. If this is a story of sanctification, this guy sometimes seems to be going backwards. And I think it's important to remember that like this emphasis on he is himself not holy. He's the knight of holiness, but by himself he is not holy. When he lays aside his armor in another canto, he is immediately overtaken by temptation. He ends up in the literally the pit of despair at one point. So it's just I think he is a much more like sympathetic protagonist than Christian from Pilgrim's Progress. Who Christian has his moments, but I think this guy just the experience of a Christian going through life and constantly feeling like you're not sufficient, but having to do your job anyway. That I think at least it strikes me as very familiar. And, I think it makes him a better protagonist.
Yes, I entirely agree.
Should we talk about Una a little bit?
Yeah, Una is a princess.
When is she first named? She's not named here.
It's a bit further down.
She's called the Lady for a while.
Right.
She may not get her name until after they're separated. Or, I'll have to double check.
We'll have to pay attention for that. But at this point, she is not named. We know she's Una because we've read the whole book, but she is not yet Una here. Here she is the lady, and particularly she is the lady of the quest. The Red Cross Knight has a specific quest that she has been given, or that he has been given by Gloriana, the Queen of Fairyland, and that is to fight a dragon that has a kingdom held captive. And that kingdom is the one this lady's from. Her father and her mother are held prisoner by this dragon.
So kind of classic damsel in distress. She plays a little bit more of a role in that because she advises him. Even in this first canto, she gets separated from him through his own foolishness. But in many ways, she's sort of the damsel in distress figure that you might find in any knight story. Allegorically, you want to talk about her representation as an allegorical figure?
Allegorically, she represents the church. We don't know her name yet, Una or One, but that makes sense in the story because you don't need to know that the church is one and that this church is the right one until another comes along.
Is she not named Una Vera Fides, the one true faith?
I think that's I don't know that they ever come out and give that full phrase, but that's the reference.
Right. So the knight, again, we talked about this earlier, but the complication of the allegory, does that mean the Christian pursuing holiness is leading and rescuing the one true faith? Well, no, that's not how it works theologically. Accompanied by the one true faith, I suppose. But the allegory is much more tangled and complicated than it is a straightforward fable.
I do like the suggestion of heroism here, though, from Spenser. This is the book of holiness. It's a book about not starting holy and then doing the things that holiness does, but starting desiring but lacking that characteristic, and the tough journey of getting sanctified, of becoming holy in word and deed and will and feeling and all the rest of it. And that in some sense, we have this church we have these two terms that we've received of the saints in heaven are the church triumphant, but the saints on earth, Christians here, are the church militant, the church that is still in the fight. And so George, as an individual, as the image of an individual Christian, is to fight for the sake of the church. He is contending for the safety and the peace and purity of the church in his battle for holiness. There is something at stake. In some sense, Una, the one true faith, the church, is ever secure, but also ever in peril. I mean, and that is our experience. There are times when the church is threatened by enemies without and also corruption within, and needs champions. And every Christian is in some sense a champion of the church, fighting for the church's peace and purity in their own quest for holiness within their own life. So it's not that the church needs to be rescued in an ultimate sense by Red Cross Knight. His Lord already won the battle. But experientially, and I think that's what Spenser is getting at, experientially, the church that we know, the church of our day, so to speak, is always in need of championing from every individual
Right.
Christian.
If every Christian ceased to fight temptation, the church would cease to fight temptation. The
Yes.
church on earth, because the church is made up of Christians. So you're right. In a sense, if he is a stand-in for all Christians, then he is in some ways the champion of the church itself. So we also have this other character, the dwarf here. I think some of our commentary might need to be focused on explaining the odd details. So she's sitting on a horse, or called here a palfrey. It's a pony. Well, I guess it says a donkey, an ass, but it's a white one, kind of unusual. And she's leading a lamb, so I think this represents kind of her innocence. But then she's accompanied. They have this dwarf to carry their baggage for them. And I had a footnote that the dwarf is a representation of reason. But again, like in the opening image, if this was a painting, you say, okay, this is the Christian, this is the faith, there's innocence, and then this is reason that kind of lags behind, but still is accompanying them. But as the story goes on, the dwarf doesn't really play a huge role in
No.
that story. So if you were if Plato were writing this, the dwarf would be a major character.
Oh, yeah.
As Spenser kind of forgets about him, and just he sort of drifts off, and he does rescue Red Cross from the House of Pride, but
Yes.
or at least guide him away.
This is not Thomas Aquinas's Faerie Queene.
No, right? That would there's a reason I think Thomas did not write a Faerie Queene. So anyway,
He does play that role in a couple of scenes. The dwarf does get to be the voice of common sense, or the voice of prudence in a few scenes. Mostly he's just sort of there. Though this also is a trope, the notion of a servant following the lady in chivalric romance, and often that servant role is filled by a dwarf, not a Tolkien dwarf, an actual small person. That's a pretty common thing in chivalric romance. So Spenser is borrowing the trope.
They're moving across this plain. A rainstorm catches up with them, and they seek shelter in a wood. And Spenser goes into a couple of stanzas of detail describing the trees in the wood, and how the wood was like fully very leafy and gave them a lot of shelter. And do you think there's anything to the anything significant in his descriptions, or the catalog of trees, or is he just showing off or taking up space?
So this is a really interesting pair of stanzas in book one. One that, when I've had the opportunity to teach the Faerie Queene, we've camped on these stanzas for a couple of moments. Something that I think we're going to be observing as we keep reading through the Faerie Queene is the way that in some moments Spenser will try to use poetry in order to bring the reader into the experience of the characters in the story. And here, at the level of plot, to escape weather, as you said, they run into the woods. They're just trying to get out of the rain. But then they get lost. Similarly, as we read stanzas 8 and 9 of Canto 1, as they walk among these trees, you then get a catalog of trees. About half of stanza 8 and all of stanza 9, each line is a pair of trees, each with its own description. And so as they are getting lost, and in some sense losing the plot, we are also getting lost and losing the plot. So that by the end of it, you're like, wait, why are we here?
Right.
Why are we in these woods? Why did we just look at all of these trees?
Right. I think that is going to come up again. To me, that's a really important part, that Spenser's not just telling you about the growth of a Christian, but he's also basically walking you through that process in the process of reading his poem. I wish this were a more common text for students to read, because it really draws you through each of these stages that Red Cross is going through. That is really apparent in book 9.
Though there is also something ominous in the description of the trees. Some are the sailing pine, the cedar, not just tall, but proud and tall. Then the vine prop elm, the poplar, never dry.
The cypress for funerals, and then it ends with the maple, seldom inward sound.
Yeah, there's something ominous in these trees, this notion of unsoundness, of death, myrrh, sweet bleeding in the bitter wound, right? So this notion that something's not right here. The trees are foreshadowing something.
I also, just as a side note, whenever I read books like this, I am embarrassed at how few trees I can identify. It may actually be that there's fewer, just because of the way woodlands have changed. That there are actually fewer species in a given square mile of woods. But like if I go on a walk in the woods, I'm like, there's a pine tree, there's not a pine tree,
Right.
there's a pine tree.
I know it's a pecan tree because I find pecans on the ground.
Right. But as far as like telling the difference between ashes and beeches, and like it's embarrassing. Like you really want to feel like you know nothing about nature, read Watership Down, because like every I mean the whole this is definitely a sidetrack, but the whole book of Watership Down takes place in like a 4-mile range, and each like half mile has its own set of plants that he goes into detail describing. It just is this exhaustive knowledge. If you want to be a poet and praise your island, you better know the trees. Okay, so they they do get lost in the wood, but they actually follow a very well trodden path. There is a labyrinth. It's a maze, but they end up on a fairly. They take the main road, and then we get our first adventure, where the champion stout jumps off his horse and hands his spear over to the dwarf to hold, his squire essentially, and decides he's going to explore his cave. And here we have, I think, some initial bits of wisdom. We are going to try to identify proverbs and things as we go, or our favorite moments. And like the first little bit of dialogue here is Una, the lady, giving him some advice. And she was described earlier, I didn't mention this, but as learned in virtuous lore. So she has this knowledge of what right action is. And she doesn't like exactly stop him from going in the cave, but she cautions him.
Is she Lady Wisdom from the Proverbs in some
There's
sense?
definitely some parallel. There's some like descriptions of that, but you do get that more with other characters in the House of Holiness, because she's not a mother, right? She doesn't. There's certain things that Una cannot represent. Certain feminine virtues she can't represent because she's not a matron figure. So I mean, the idea of virtue does come up a lot, which we saw Spenser's training his readers in virtue. He says. So she says that. She cautions him not to go into this into this cave, and he responds, "Virtue gives herself light, though darkness forts away." Through darkness forts away. So he's pretty cocky at this point. I'll walk into this cave. Don't worry, I'll be my own light. And I mean, his armor does shine a little bit, his glistering armor, but it's not, unfortunately, enough. He's not Gandalf the White.
Is it Tennyson that in the Idylls of the King has, I think it's Galahad saying something like, "My strength is as the strength of 10 because my heart is pure."
Yeah.
And so George kind of has that.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
at the moment.
it's classic, like, foolish protagonist, but he barely squeaks through this first adventure.
He's got main character energy, as the kids say.
You're right. So we get this description of error, and we definitely have. This is, I think, well, there's quite a lot of very straightforward, strong allegorical figures. This is one that's very straightforward, partly because this character is dealt with in this canto, where some of them go on and on and on, and it like these villains, and they just get more and more complicated, and you're like, wait, do you still represent what I was told you represent?
Yeah.
It's the ones that just show up in little snapshots that are like the most like Crayola colored allegorical figures. So I think Error is one of those. She's called Error, and then she appears, attacks, is dealt with, and then you don't have to think about her again. So she's described as kind of this snaky figure that tangles you up, which again, being tangled in the errors. Specifically, it seems like theological errors.
Yes. There's a moment where she vomits, and what she vomits. This is stanza 20. Her vomit is full of books and papers. So this notion that what error has inside of her and what embodies the poison of error as it's brought forth is writing, theological writing.
And eyeless frogs and toads. Don't forget about that.
Well, yeah.
This is the thing. You're like, okay. Books and papers. And then Spencer's just like, also, there was creepy things in there, too. Don't forget about them.
This is so over the top, though. We see in stanza 13, Una gives her reason why Red Cross Knight should back off, which is, this is the wandering wood, this error's den. And then quoth the fearful dwarf, fly, fly, this is no place for living men. So he goes into this fight knowing what the enemy represents, but the enemy is error, is theological error, is heresy, is getting fundamental spiritual truths wrong. That's what this creature represents. Yeah. But she's so easy to spot. She looks ugly. All right, everything about her represents in some way.
She's in a creepy cave.
Yes.
The dwarf identifies her, or at least gives the knight good counsel. The lady knows exactly what this is when she sees it. So this is, surely there's subtler errors waiting for him.
And there are.
There are, even in the first canto.
Yeah. My pet theory about book 1 is that this first encounter is Spenser's trap for Red Cross Knight, but also for us. We think that error has been conquered because this first monster is easily spotted and easily disposed of. And yet, Red Cross Knight just keeps being deceived.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's kind of his thing. Honestly.
Yeah, for the rest of the book.
Yeah.
Until finally, at the very end, he encounters another serpent that represents another kind of error. So in a lot of ways, I don't think error ever really dies.
Yeah.
We see error die here. But the fight with error is not over because, in fact, he's just going to keep wandering. He's just going to keep being tricked and, in some cases, even deceiving himself.
I think of C.S. Lewis. I can't remember if it's in Mere Christianity or in the Screwtape Letters or Surprised by Joy, maybe. But he mentions this tendency of new Christians. They have very obvious temptations. And they conquer them, and they feel like this is spiritual success or spiritual growth. Look, I was tempted to do, to get drunk, and I didn't. And like as they grow, it's exactly the same thing here, where it's this super obvious problem monster that he can just beat by sheer strength. Like Error wraps her tail around him. He breaks out with one arm with his sword, chops her to bits. And that's success. Whereas some of the other antagonists he comes up against aren't that easy to defeat. And he needs help, or he tries and fails and tries and fails. Whereas this one, it's kind of like that first, yeah, I got it, and then you realize, no, there's actually far subtler and more dangerous enemies waiting for you later.
I think there's foreshadowing of that. Even in the middle of the battle, she wraps her snaky body around him. Stanza 18 ends, God help the man so wrapped in error's endless train. So then Una cries out, now, Sir Knight, show what ye be. Show who you are. Add faith unto your force and be not faint, which in some way seems reversed. We might think this is the knight of faith, and he's gotten into this because he's like, my virtue is bright and shiny. I will win. I have a just cause. So we might expect her to say, add force to your faith. But that's not what she says. She says, add faith unto your force. As if up until this point, all he's been doing is just his own strength. Add faith to your force. And listen to his reaction. When he heard, in great perplexity, his gall did grate for grief and high disdain. This is not the reaction of faith. He feels embarrassed
Right.
and he feels anger and disdain at being exposed as weak, and knitting all his force, got one hand free wherewith he gripped her gorge. Right. So he does defeat her in the end, but the word faith never shows up again. It's just force.
This is a very young man adventure where I don't know why, but this line has always stuck in my mind. Strangle her, else she sure will strangle thee, that Una says to him. And just this idea that like the spiritual battle sometimes requires force. You've got to chop Sin's head off. I think that appeals to the young man. He's like, oh man, this is awesome. And, like you said, he does escape through his force, but it's not, like within a page, he's fallen victim to another deceiver, like a far more dangerous one.
What's the quote everyone knows from the later English author, mortification of sin? Be killing your sin, or your sin will be killing you.
Yes. Is that Owen?
Yeah, it's John Owen.
John Owen.
Yeah, this is the same idea before Owen. Yeah. Strangle error, or she will strangle you.
And just to like more of Spenser's like gleeful description, this sort of Miyazaki moment where the air monster gets so all of her young hide in her mouth.
Yes.
So air is kind of a speech. She never actually speaks, but all of the symbols, like she's vomiting out books and papers, all of her little baby airs come crawling out of her mouth. When her head gets chopped off, they try to rush back in, and her mouth is nowhere to be found. So instead, they drink her blood and then explode. And again, it's kind of like teaching this to students. They would just, I did as a high schooler, was just delighted with that moment. There's some, you kind of enjoy reading about Satan in Paradise Lost, but some of the other parts of Paradise Lost get a little bit dry, the high language. And this was just like so much fun to read.
Yeah.
So ridiculous.
The gross, disgusting little error babies swelling up and popping. It's garbage pail kids. It's, as a kid of the 80s who grew up on things like Gremlins and just general gross out humor. Spenser beat me there.
We need to get to Archimago, I think. So as we've been kind of hinting at, the very next adventure they have, so the Red Cross Knight beats Error, climbs back on his steed, thinks, he's all that, makes a notch on his shield, no doubt, or on his saddle bow. And then immediately they meet this aged sire in long black weeds clad. And we have this example of extreme piety. He's carrying his book. He is knocking his breast in the symbol of repentance. He hears of their adventure. He offers them a place to stay. And his hermitage is lowly, and there's a chapel and a stream. And he's saying Ave Marias like a saint. Do you think that we're supposed to be suspicious already?
So on one hand, this is a trope in chivalric romance, especially Arthurian chivalric romance, and you see it probably best in the Grail sequence of romances, whether you're reading the kind of translations of the French versions or reading Mallory's version. A knight will have some kind of allegorical encounter, will fight Galahad will fight some kind of evil knight or rescue someone from prison or some other kind of adventure. And then after that adventure, we'll encounter a monk or a hermit who tends to Galahad's wounds if he has any, offers him food and drink, and then explains the theological significance of the adventure he just had. So we've already observed in the last episode or last couple of episodes the ways that Spenser is drawing on the tropes of chivalric romance, and so here is one. Knight has just had a holy adventure. Holy Knight has had holy adventure, so now here comes Holy Sage. We expect him almost, if we have read that kind of chivalric romance that Spenser is riffing on, drawing on as a source. Except if we are good Church of England Protestants, we are going to be immediately suspicious as he bids his beads, as he strews aves, as he tells stories of popes and saints. We will wonder what sort of person we're dealing with. I mean, and just remembering, as we said in the last couple of episodes, Protestant England under Elizabeth is deeply suspicious of the Roman Church because the Roman Church is not merely a theological rival to Protestantism, but also has political power. And so secret Jesuits, Elizabeth knows, Englishmen know, secret Jesuits are moving among the English in the English countryside, collaborating with underground English Catholics in ways that the Protestants find deeply suspicious. So if you were paying attention to that sort of thing, you might feel your suspicions raised. But yeah, not Red Cross Knight. He's just
I mean, he's inexperienced, right?
yes.
Yeah. I mean, as we'll see, he's just so easily deceived. It's hard not to like him. He's just such a rash, like sure he's right, and always not always wrong, but it is fun to see his growth as a character.
He's not always wrong for the wrong reasons.
Right.
He's frequently tricked, and so you can have sympathy for him for that reason. He's in some ways a lovable fool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So they stay the night with Archimago, who's not been named yet, I believe. I think he's named in stanza 43 for the first time. I did like this part in stanza 35. It says, "Arrived there, the little house they fill, and they looked for entertainment where none was. Rest is their feast, and all things at their will. The noblest mind the best contentment has." So there's nothing for them to do. There's no entertainment, but it doesn't matter because they're content with their surroundings. And I don't think he's being ironic here. I don't think I think it's another one of those moments of Spenser making these little asides of here's my characters acting in a way that is worth imitating. If you find yourself in humble surroundings with nothing to do, don't let that faze you. You're if you have a noble mind, if you're trained in virtue, you'll never be without something to do. Just meditate on truth and goodness.
Good little Spenserian proverb.
And of course, the Archimago is there too. He has pleasing words, and his tongue is as smooth as glass.
But he's filing his tongue as smooth as glass, and immediately, wait a second, that's a weapon image.
Yes.
His tongue is sharp.
And then, of course, immediately as they fall asleep, he goes to his study and pulls out all his magic books. And I love the choosing out few words most horrible, let none them read. Thereof did verses frame. And Spenser's just, the magic spell is so horrible, I can't even write them down. You kind of feel like he's sort of gleeful in describing the darkness of like it's so bad I can't say it.
Super holy hermit, just sort of walks out the door after they're asleep and just immediately goes dark wizard.
Yeah.
It's
and there's other characters like that where he'll Spenser will say things like, "I just can't even describe it, how bad it was," which actually, in a way, like activates your imagination more so. So he has two. He's it's a double deception. He's got so he got two. He calls up a series of sprites to do his bidding and selects two of them. One who's going to carry a message to Morpheus, the god of sleep, and the other is he's going to keep there and shape into the likeness of a beautiful woman. Is that right, or is it a lusty youth? I can't remember.
So the lusty youth is not yet. One he gave a message to, the other by himself stayed other work to do. So first we see what happens with the messenger. The messenger brings back dreams, essentially. The messenger is sent to Morpheus, god of sleep, who is in not the Matrix guy, is sent to the underworld to get some spirits who are in the service of Morpheus, the god of sleep, who sends dreams. So he's going to send dreams to work on St. George while he's asleep, to sort of try to change his mood, to introduce thoughts into his sleeping mind that he wouldn't entertain when he was awake. Specifically, lustful dreams.
Yeah.
So that when he wakes up and finds this other spirit that was serving the Magus made to look like Una in his bedroom, the lustful dreams were meant to be kind of preparing him to fall to this temptation.
Right. Do you think there's any significance to this as the first appearance of the kind of classical pagan figures? I don't always get the sense that Spenser is like against the classical gods, that they're always necessarily bad. But so far, the first time that anyone's come into contact with them is Archimago through his wicked arts.
Right. Well, we did encounter them in the invocation, but you're right. It is Archimago and his magical arts, but who is he summoning? I mean, this is back in stanza 37. He bade awake black Pluto's grisly dame. So Pluto or Hades, Persephone or Proserpina. He curses heaven. He calls great Gorgon, at whom Cocytus quakes and Styx is put to flight. So he's
doing witchery.
Yeah, he's invoking the chthonic deities, the underworld deities, which on one hand are serving as stand-ins for Satan here, but also we should be reminded, and Spenser I think expects us to be reminded of the invocations of underworld gods by Dido in the Aeneid.
Yep.
And also the Sibyl. So this notion of infernal deities who are strong to curse, who can be invoked for evil purposes, is something that he gets. He's drawing on language that's parallel with classical sources.
Yeah.
But it's also the sort of thing that a Christian would expect. They believe that if you're a wizard, you're in league with the underworld. You're in league with the powers of hell.
It's almost by definition, right? What is magic? It's being in connection with the dread gods, the gods of the underworld. Is 45 the first time Una's name is mentioned?
I think it might be. That's the first time I've noticed
bizarre. It's italicized there. Isn't that normally they do that to highlight the first mention of a name?
Yeah.
It's kind of odd.
Yeah. Well, it's the point that we made before. The onlyness, the aloneness of Una, the only true, is not necessary to say until there is a counterfeit.
That's true. Yeah.
And so this is our first counterfeit. He made a lady of that other sprite and framed of liquid air. So this is an airy spirit. The way that he's talking about it, about how this spirit assumes a semi-material form, is much the way you hear medieval theologians talk about what an incubus or a succubus is. because they firmly believed that there were demons who can seduce humans, not merely kind of mentally, but also even physically.
Yeah.
That's how this is described.
Right. And I do think again, we have a sort of, it's a early Christian deception here. And I don't mean historically. I mean like a new Christian. So, I mean, as a young man, it always struck me as odd that Dante placed lust so high in Hades.
Yeah.
So high in hell, because I
Yeah.
thought as a young man, you're like, man, lust is like the worst thing ever.
Yeah.
Because it plagues you so much.
Yes.
But then as, so the Night of Holiness, I don't think it's accidental that this is one of the first attacks. It's like very obvious error. The next attack is an attack of lust. He's having these lustful dreams. He wakes up, there's a beautiful, like it looks to him like Una has now gotten into bed with him. And again, that's like a sort of like very surface. I mean, just such an obvious temptation.
Yeah.
It's like beginning of Proverbs, watch out for this. The adulteress, she's coming after you. It's just like level 1. Well, maybe level 2 temptation.
As a kid brought up in the 80s, in the golden era of Dare, this is that classic, rough looking kid comes up to you and like, hey kid, here are some drugs.
Right.
Be cool like us.
Right, exactly.
And he's like, no, I won't.
Right. And it's not that it's not a temptation to him.
No, it
but
is
that
a
it is a
temptation.
very obvious temptation.
Right.
And he's able to say, no, this is not, we're not doing this. And she's all kind of, well, the sprite in Una's guise is all whimpering and, oh, don't you love me? And but he's able to hold her at arm's length, which again fills him with pride. He conquered error, and now he's resisting lust.
Mm-hmm.
And what can't he do?
The point, though, of this, there's kind of a twofold aim to this. There is the literal level where a knight is being seduced into betraying his lady by magic. And then below that, there is the allegory in which the result of this temptation is to make a breach, to make a gap in George's faith. Mm-hmm. Red Cross Knight begins to doubt Una, begins to doubt whether she's trustworthy,
right.
Begins to doubt her virtue and her chastity. And for that reason, he falls to the next trap.
Yeah, it's a 1-2 punch here.
So taken in the allegory, this new Christian is first confronted with things that might lead him to doubt the church that has guided him so far. And his faith is shaken in this way. And this is the most fundamental error, the most critical misstep in George's path to holiness, is that when he is tempted to doubt the church who has guided him thus far, that is when he strays and becomes so vulnerable and spends most of the rest of the book needing to find his way back.
Yeah, I mean, that is kind of the plot of the book.
Yep.
I think we're about at an hour of Canto 1. Is there anything, any favorite bits? We clearly enjoy the error passage.
Oh, yeah.
We described it with glee, I think. So I think this is, we'll wrap up the episode unless there's anything.
No, I just, as you're reading through it, luxuriate in this. I think next time I'd like to find a good Spenserian simile
There
to
were
settle
a couple
in
of
on.
good ones. Epic similes. The when he's fighting error, you get the Nile.
Yeah.
All her vomit or par break
Mm-hmm.
spreads out like Father Nihilus. And then you also get the all of her little young crowd around him, but they're nothing more than gnats to him. He just kind of bats them away. They don't have any real negative effect.
Well, there's some amazing ones in stanza 2. So
In Canto 2.
yeah, in Canto 2. So I think we can look forward to
Yeah.
digging into that.
All right. Join us next time.